Okay, I'll quickly take you through how the major histocompatibility complex differentiates between your own cells inside your body and something that is not belonging to your body. Okay, so I will quickly take you through that in this bit of the video. Okay, so we had looked at what the major histocompatibility complex is and how it plays an important role in the immune system. So what it does majorly is it helps the body to recognize its own cells, what we refer to as self, and detect foreign invaders, so anything that is not self. Okay. So by differentiating between self and non-self, it therefore helps the immune system to be able to attack what is foreign but tolerate what is not foreign. So your immune system therefore is able kupigana na ile yenye inaweza sababisha ugonjwa, lakini inavumilia your normal healthy body cells. So the immune system does not attack your healthy cell, but it attacks an invader, something that is non-self, something that is foreign. So you think of the MHC, it's like at the university gate when you are getting in. When they look at you with your ID, maybe they allow you to get in. If you don't have an ID, then you are a foreigner. But if you have an ID, they look at it and no, this one is a student in the university. So they allow you in and nothing happens. But if you are not a student, then you are labeled as foreign. So the MHC, as we saw, is these are proteins which are found on the cell surfaces. And what they do is that they help to display protein fragments. So these protein fragments, they display them to immune cells. Okay. So these protein fragments that are being displayed to the immune cells are the ones that help the immune system to determine whether that cell that the proteins came from is part of the body or it is an invader. The protein that is being displayed by the MHC comes from a cell. So the cell that that protein comes from is what the immune system will use that protein that is being displayed to determine whether the cell that the protein came from is either part of your body, as now recognize it as being self, or if it is part of an invader, then now the immune system will recognize it as being foreign. So if it is recognized as being part of your body, as being self, then your immune system will tolerate it. So it does not attack your own body cells. But if it is recognized as a foreigner, as an invader, then now the immune system has to be mobilized so that it can attack it, because it is possible that it could be a disease-causing pathogen. The MHC comes in two main types, and I'm sure you know, the MHC class 1 and the MHC class 2. So the MHC class 1 is found on almost all nucleated cells, cells that have the nucleus. Then the MHC class 1 helps in presenting proteins from inside the cell, so intracellular proteins. MHC class 2, these ones are found on antigen-presenting cells, what we call the APCs. So the antigen-presenting cells, they include macrophages, dendritic cells. Okay. And now what the MHC class 2 does, it presents proteins from outside the cell. So the extracellular proteins. Okay? The extracellular proteins. Okay, so let's now move ahead and begin to look at how exactly does the MHC recognize or detect what is self. When a cell that belongs to you, to your body, how does the MHC detect that this cell is part of your body, but this other cell comes from outside your body? So the first thing is, how does the MHC detect self? So by detecting self, it helps your immune system not to attack self. Okay? So if you are team, kama ni mpira mnacheza, it's important to know who is your teammate and who is your opponent. If you have your ball, you'll give it to your teammate. But if your opponent has the ball, you will go and mark the opponent. It's the same thing with the MHC, your immune system. So for a football team, you'll be looking at the uniform, possibly. Okay? For you to know, kwamba hii uniform inafanana na yangu, so huyu, I can pass the ball to him. But huyu mwingine, akiwa na mpira, I need to go and attack. It's the same thing with the immune system. So when you are looking at the uniform to know, the uniform is put on by the player on the outside. It's the same thing. The MHC will be displaying the proteins on the outside. So when the uniform looks like yours, then you know that this is part of my team. Okay? So let's see how the MHC class 1 does that. So all cells within our body, they continuously break down their proteins into smaller pieces. So a protein is a polypeptide. It's made up of many peptides. So when you break down those many peptides, you now get the individual peptides. So once those individual peptides have been obtained by breaking down the proteins within the cells, then those peptides will be attached to MHC class 1 molecules. Then these MHC class 1 molecules will display the peptides on the outside of the cell surface. Okay? Then now, the immune cells, the cytotoxic T cells, or the CD8 cells. CD8 are the ones that work with MHC class 1. So the CD8 will be scanning around. So it is now the CD8 to look at the peptides that are being displayed on the cell surface to establish whether they belong to a normal body cell or whether they are not. So if the CD8 recognizes them to be coming from a body cell, and if they are normal, then the T cells will ignore them because they are part of its own. It's like when you are playing football, then you have uko na mpira as a goalkeeper. You cannot pass it to a striker of the opposite team, but you can pass it to your defender, because your defender will not score in your own goal. The defender will be trying to prevent a score. So it's the same thing. When the cytotoxic T cells recognize that these proteins, they come from a cell in this body, and that cell is normal, then they will, So when you are a defender, you will not mark your fellow striker, so long as muko na uniform same. Okay? So how do you recognize that this person is belonging to my team? He's a striker, yes, but he is a striker in our team uniform. So the cytotoxic T cells, they scan what the MHC class 1, the peptide that the MHC class 1 is displaying on the outside of the cell. So the cytotoxic T cells ni kama macho sasa, hiyo ndio inaangalia, then the peptides on the outside, hiyo ni kama uniform ya team. Okay? Hiyo ni kama uniform ya team. So if the cytotoxic T cells naona hiyo uniform inafanana na cells zake, ina recognize hiyo kama belonging to them. Then now they will not mobilize an attack because it is belonging to self. It's part of the normal body cells. Okay? So let's move and see what happens to the MHC class 2. So MHC class 2 works with a specialized group of immune cells, what we call the antigen presenting cells. So the antigen presenting cells, just like these other cells, they also process and present proteins. Okay. So if proteins are part of self or not, they will also present them, but the antigen presenting cells work with the MHC class 2. Then the helper T cells or the CD4. These ones are now the ones that will keep checking the peptides that are being presented on the outside of the cell by MHC class 2. So the same thing, if the peptides are from the same body, from your body, then the immune system will ignore them. Okay? So the immune system will ignore them. So maybe the question we are asking ourselves is, how does it know? How are these T cells? Because the helper T cells and the cytotoxic T cells, these are types of T cells. So how are they trained to recognize what is self from what is non-self? So the T cells are trained in the thymus. And the ones that are able to recognize the MHC are kept. But the ones that are not able, they are eliminated. So there is positive selection for the T cells that are able to recognize the MHC. So it means whatever is selected to live, ile yenye inawekwa ni ile yenye imeweza kukuwa na uwezo wa kurecognize the MHC. So by doing so, then all the T cells that will not mistakenly attack normal body cells are kept. Okay? They are kept. Okay, let's now move and see how the MHC now detects non-self. We've been talking about the self, how it recognizes the self and it accommodates it, or it ignores, it does not attack it. But now in this case, how does it recognize non-self, an invader? And once it recognizes an invader, it has now to activate an immune system. Kama ni kwa mpira, ukiona striker, an opponent ako na mpira, based on the uniform, you have to activate an attack. Okay, on the opponent. So the MHC class 1 is charged with detecting internal threats because it deals with presenting proteins from inside the cell. Okay, inside the cell. So if you remember HIV or any other virus, once they infect a cell, they make that cell to begin making proteins for that virus. So once proteins that are being made by that cell that has been attacked or infected by a virus, the proteins that are being made are now viral proteins. Because the cell, its protein making machinery has been hijacked by the virus. So as it produces its cell proteins, it also produces viral proteins. So the proteins that are being produced by that cell then, as they are being broken down, they will be displayed by the MHC class 1 on the outside of that cell. So the cytotoxic T cells or the CD8 will now be able to recognize the peptides on the outside of the cell because they are viral. There is a virus inside this cell. So the proteins that are being produced in the cell are proteins of the virus. And they are the same proteins that have been displayed by the MHC class 1 on the outside of the cell, on the cell surface. So that cytotoxic T cells, or the CD8 cells, will now recognize these viral peptides as foreign. And once it recognizes them as being foreign, it now leads to the destruction of that infected cell. Okay? So similarly, if a cell becomes cancerous, it will begin to produce abnormal proteins. So once the abnormal proteins are broken down into abnormal peptides, because the proteins are abnormal based on what makes them, and what builds them up are peptides. So once these abnormal proteins are broken down, the peptides that are created from breaking down these abnormal proteins will be displayed on the cell surface of that particular cell using MHC class 1. So once they are displayed as being abnormal, the immune system will be alerted so that it can come and destroy that cell. Okay? So MHC class 1, internal threats, internal intracellular proteins. So you are thinking of either a cell is cancerous or a cell has been infected by a virus. So the proteins are coming from inside that cell. Let's see how now the MHC class 2 detects these external threats. Because MHC class 2 deals with extracellular proteins. And the MHC class 2, they work closely with the antigen-presenting cells, so things like macrophages, dendritic cells. So what the APCs do, they will engulf a bacteria. So it aneza your bacteria, then as it engulfs it, it breaks it down into pieces. Okay? So these fragments, these pieces of the bacteria that has been broken down after being engulfed by the macrophage, which is part of the antigen-presenting cell, those fragments are the ones that will be displayed on the surface of the APC. On the surface of the APC, what displays the fragments of the bacteria or the pathogen are the MHC class 2 molecules. Then now, the helper T cells ndio itakuwa inazunguka sasa kuangalia kwa surface ya hiyo antigen presenting cell, ione the peptides that are being displayed hapo. Are they foreign or are they not foreign? But because they were created by breaking down a bacteria, they will be recognized as foreign. Then now the immune system is activated. Okay? So MHC class 2 deals with extracellular threats, extracellular proteins. Most of these antigen-presenting cells, talk of dendritic cells, macrophages, they will engulf these foreign pathogens, these invaders, bacteria, parasites. To engulf is to sort of swallow. Remember phagocytosis. So they will swallow it. And once they've swallowed it, they now break it down, sort of they digest it. Then the product of that breaking down or that digestion will be fragments of whatever was swallowed. Those fragments are the ones that will be picked by the MHC class 2. Then upon being picked, the MHC class 2 will now display them on the antigen presenting cell. Then the helper T cells or the CD4, hizo ndio sasa zinazunguka zinapiga patrol na zinaangalia, zinaona whatever is being displayed on the surface of the antigen presenting cell is actually belonging to a bacteria or a parasite. A bacteria or a parasite is foreign. So once the helper T cell recognizes it as being foreign, it now activates the immune response so that it can clear it. Okay. So the activation of the immune system, the immune response, to bring forth the immune response, they signal B cells, so that these B cells can now lead to the production of antibodies. Then the antibodies produced are the ones that will now neutralize the pathogen. Okay. So they will signal the B cells to produce antibodies. Then those antibodies will lead to neutralization of that bacteria or parasite. But what happens if the major histocompatibility complex fails? So one thing that if it fails, then you expect kwamba the immune system will not be able to differentiate between self and non-self. It's as if you are playing football with the same uniform. So it is difficult to know whom to mark and whom not to mark. So if the MHC fails, you begin having the autoimmune diseases. So they occur when the immune system now mistakenly begins to attack it's the cells that belong to the individual body. Okay, so that's an autoimmune disease. If the MHC fails, so that it cannot now be in a position to recognize these foreign invaders, then there can be immune evasion. So the disease-causing microorganisms or the cancerous cells will now begin to avoid being detected by the immune system. So that is immune evasion. So in summary, the MHC class 1 presents self and viral peptides to CD8 T cells or the cytotoxic T cells. So if they happen to be foreign, the peptides that are presented by the MHC class 1, if they happen to be foreign, then the infected cell will be destroyed. The cell where these peptides come from, it will be destroyed. The MHC class 2, on the other hand, presents the external pathogen peptides to CD4 T helper cells. Okay, so if in this case they are already coming from an external pathogen, then the immune system will be activated, where the B cells will now produce antibodies. Then those antibodies are the ones that will now neutralize these external pathogen, because the peptides are being produced by that external pathogen. So if there is self-tolerance. Self-tolerance means your body is able to tolerate its own cells. So the self-tolerance mechanism is what helps to prevent the immune system from attacking normal cells. Okay? So if that self-tolerance and the ability of the MHC class 2 and MHC class 1 to work efficiently, that is now what will enable your body and its immune system to recognize threats. So if they recognize threats, then you are able to neutralize them. But at the same time, they should be able to recognize what is self so that you prevent damage to your own body tissues. Okay? So that is how the major histocompatibility complex is able to differentiate between what is self and what is non-self. So I'm sharing these notes with you, but the notes are just from page 1 to page 3. Then from page 4, you have notes talking about what I've explained, but now in a simplified manner. So when you read from page 4 to page 6, you are just reading a simplified version of the notes that I've explained. So this page 4 to 6, they help you to understand. But when you are answering, you don't use the idea of ID badges and other things. They are just giving you explanations in a simple way so that you can understand. So for these ones, read all of them from page 1 to page 6. But from page 4 to 6, they are just simplifying issues so that you can understand in a easier way. So I'll share them, read them through, and in case you have a question, I'm happy to respond. Thank you very much.